Chapter 91. Well, there was everything considered little reason to endanger the lives of the innocent with such a drastic solution, since you still had plenty of time to come up with something a little more controllable. That you already had plenty of innocent blood on your hands was bad enough as it was, and you had absolutely no wish to dirty them even further if there were still alternatives that just demanded a little more effort. Thus, with your mind made up, you wandered through the streets to find out what it was that had the population up in arms despite the prevailing threat of the mountain clans. Not that you seriously thought for so much as a second that there was a singular reason behind all this madness, as the average commoner of Westeros was just far too tamed by his lords and culture for that to be the case. There was a decent chance that a lack of food was the culprit like so often in times of war, but while you were sure that the mountain clan raids made farming a living nightmare, that would have probably resulted in more animosity towards the refugees than you were able to make out. And from what you could see there also was no sign of looting beyond what one might expect with all the chaos, so it stood to reason that Nora had yet to run out of essential supplies. There was also the fact that the merchants were still breathing, so the unrest most likely wasn't directly connected to a lack of supplies or the difference in wealth that usually riled the populace up when the right circumstances aligned. It would have been far easier to simply inquire about what was going on directly, but you still had no clue how such a question would be received, since such agitated people would in your experience not take kindly to the questions of a stranger. Furthermore, even if you risked it there was still the chance that you would have received nothing but lies or simple misinformation for your silver, which naturally required that you would need to repeat the process over and over again just to get that common consensus. Hence, you swiftly returned your focus back to the present. There was simply no way an assassin worth his pay such as yourself would rush the gathering of information like that. The mere thought revolted you, but you did it in the past when it was required and time was of the essence, so openly inquiring was always an option. Despite its state, there were 3 places of importance in Nora that still remained intact for obvious reasons which would have been optimal to gather information, but you found that both Watermoon and the Harbour District were for the time being closed off to you. You would of course still be able to slip in between the patrols around the Harbour District if it became truly necessary, but with Watermoon being as watched as it was from both the in and outside, there was little point in trying even if it were required. It was a bit bothersome that you were so limited in your options as you remained set on avoiding any additional loss of innocent life, but as long as Nora's sept remained the center of activity you could deal with it. For while the information you could gather from there was probably a little one-sided, you had enough trust in the faith of Nora's populace that outright lies a few meters from the sept wouldn't go unpunished in such desperate times, so things should still work out. Hardship for obvious reasons tended to draw forth some zealotry in even the kindest of souls, which mixed with the fact that few had the inclination to anger the gods on top of their already existing troubles meant, at least as far as you could reason, that few would bother to spread misinformation. And hey, you had already planned to thank the gods for quite some time, so mayhaps it was even fated that things were arranged as they were, considering that the sept would have probably been the last place you would have visited had you been occupied with writing reports for your master. The Sept of Corvus, as you learned it was called, and the market surrounding it were the only places left untouched by the rebellion as far as you could tell, as its state was still far from acceptable for the vital role it served. Though after your stare was noticed by the old lady behind the counter as you bought yourself a bowl of soup, you got your explanation far quicker than you could have hoped for, as the sept and its state was apparently directly connected to the rebellion House Palno had been facing. If her words are to be believed, the good Lord Palno had decided that instead of reinforcing the walls or repairing the sept, it was of far greater importance to whitewash the at the time still beautiful walls and towers of Watermoon anew. Or in other words, the reason the population of Nora had thrown anything they had at the once pristine walls of Watermoon was essentially your master's decision that House Lannister's representatives were going to make use of Nora's harbour. What a mess. If this wasn't madness, you really didn't know what else the word was there to describe, for while you were aware that some lords of the Vale had a bit too much pride for their own good, this was truly unreasonable. Half the Vale was still being burned to the ground and overrun by the troops of the mountain clans, and his own town was so overcrowded that even the sept opened its doors for the people in need, and yet Lord Palno chose to risk a rebellion. It was hard to believe, but it also rang true, despite your best efforts to argue with a nice old lady that no one could possibly be that detached from reality, that a letter was all it took for this madness to happen. This was a problem. It's not unheard of that people spend more than they should to impress others, but the young fool that took over his house apparently never learned enough common sense for the populace to accept him, so they acted. But these commoners weren't stupid, for they knew before they did anything that even if all of Nora was willing to fight House Palno with the high walls of Watermoon would have prevailed in the end. Hence, this mess of a rebellion that on the surface achieved a whole lot of nothing actually targeted the representatives of House Lannister that would naturally make the Eyrie their goal, and in doing so they were guaranteed to draw the gaze of House Arryn once this madness was inevitably brought up. Chapter 92. No matter from where you looked at it, this was one hell of a gamble, and you had trouble understanding how the Arryns had managed to cultivate enough trust that these people were essentially willing to bet the lives of their loved ones on their decision. You had apparently traveled too far and too often, since their trust was something you never had the chance to experience as you traveled between Westeros and Essos together with your old master. To universally trust into one's governing body to such an extent was and would likely forevermore remain beyond your ability to comprehend, as you had learned far too much about human nature for such trust to ever form. The closest you got when it came to genuinely trusting people would be your old master, as he had been one of the pillars of your admittedly short life for years, but even so you were unable to truly comprehend blind trust like that. It would have required that you ignored the flaws of the people and the world around you, which was out of the question, as that sounded an awful lot like deluding yourself. It was as simple as that. But you supposed you would find out how this wholesome madness would turn out, since you would for the foreseeable future still be stuck in the Vale with time to spare. Though that being said, you still had the urge to help them out, as the madness that was their trust in the Arryns wasn't nearly enough to cancel out their conviction to prevail, even if they had to live in poverty while the worst in their midst grew stronger and stronger. Their plan was decent, since the good Lord Arryn was apparently one of the true paragons of the realm, even if it would have normally been pure madness to blindly plan on the virtues of others. But since you were the one they wanted to use, this massive gamble was unexpectedly sympathetic. You couldn't really describe why, but the boldness of Nora's populace simply resonated with you as they trudged through their misery, unaware that they had practically already won, despite stumbling in the dark for 9/10 of their plan. It was of course still a problem that a simple letter of your lord had done this much damage by accident to the lands he wished to hold someday, but since House Palno's lord turned out to be that incompetent, you couldn't imagine the Lannisters and your master would end up seeing what happened as a negative. Well, it was not like what you thought about how your liege saw this mess meant much, since your common sense was of course extremely unreliable when it came to his thoughts. Mayhaps he would simply be overjoyed that he got rid of a useless vassal before Lord Palno had managed to do real damage to House Lannister's future property. Or just as likely was that he could be annoyed to no end that a mistake such as this had managed to leave Casterly Rock in the first place, since he felt like a bit of a perfectionist with how he tended to use everything he managed to get his hands on. But leaving your liege and his reaction for later, you found yourself quite annoyed that you couldn't fix the madness that had claimed Nora, as long as their plan still required House Arryn's interference, as anything but complete failure would have likely resulted in little more than a slap on the wrist for House Palno. The rule of House Arryn, no matter how much trust the populace might have had in them, was after all quite flawed, as anyone that wasn't blinded could tell by the countless host of the mountain clans that should have been dealt with centuries ago. Good intentions and virtuous rule were great and all, but no matter how great the ruler, the simple fact was that there was no victory to be had, as even the best effort of the greatest ruler could only ever balance out the bad and suppress the symptoms. It was a simple fact that the Arryns and the Lords of the Vale had apparently forgotten, as if they actually thought that the struggle of good against bad that humanity had always fought with itself could simply be pushed into the far future indefinitely. Their folly made you honestly wonder just how many more Lord Palnos were still out there, as House Arryn's legendary tendency to stubbornly endure 1,000 cuts over taking action once would have naturally invited even further unprecedented incompetence like this, since the Arryns only ever moved when they smelled evil. It was ridiculous that you had to watch as Nora ripped itself apart just so that someone, namely you, would bother to tell the Arryns to come down from their castle to deal with something that was simply just bad for once. Normally it would have sounded sane to only act once you had something evil to oppose, like the raids and invasions by the mountain clans that filled the valleys of the Vale with blood, but you never understood what good it was to oppose something evil if the bad was left ignored. Like such incompetent nobles that were left to do as they pleased just because they could hardly ever be defined as evil, no matter how often the description of bad in all its forms could have been applied to how they ruled their lands. To the errants and the great lords of the Vale, something that couldn't be classified as evil was simply below their dignity to deal with, absolute madness. But only the representative of another great house would ever dare to open up that particularly dusty chest of theirs, so you honestly didn't even know who you could have blamed for remaining quiet, since you wouldn't have said anything either. Although the worst part was that this dignity of theirs apparently also meant that they had an extremely hard time asking others for their aid, which as things stood was why your lord was so taken aback by the troops of the Starks and Baratheons. In essence, the lords of the Vale had somehow managed to make sure that they suffered attrition from every corner of their lands throughout literal centuries while they never once moved against the population of the mountain clans in earnest, all because of their misguided pride and principles. You never bought into the praise you heard from the Lannister sympathizers when Tywin Lannister still managed the realm, but since the Vale was drenched in blood in nigh-complete diplomatic isolation while its lords thought about whitewashing their castles, you found that you understood where they had come from when they praised the Rock's Golden Gauntlet. Chapter 93. But despite the failings of the Errands, the populace of Nora, for all the good it did them, had put up a decent effort when it came to getting rid of House Palno, so there was a decent chance that the Vale as a whole was still savable. And the treatment of the Sept of Corvus despite the madness in the streets made it abundantly clear that the faith in the gods and their teachings was still a force of order and virtue. All in all, the lands of House Arryn had everything considered still a good chance to bounce back from the catastrophe they had suffered since the mountain clans had lost what unity they once possessed with their fanatics. And as long as the Lannisters would take over what remained of the Vale once they were done with the Errands, you honestly couldn't conceive a way that could have stopped the recovery effort, no matter how many issues the houses of the Vale could have created for them in the time that still remained. You supposed that there were still a few months or perhaps up to a year of war the Vale had to endure before the Lannisters would make their move, but since they couldn't let the crown interfere, you very much so doubted that the Lannisters had planned to wait for much longer. Ignoring the power of your master, he sounded a little bit mad when he told you that he worked in some sense for the gods, but with how things were coming along you couldn't help but wonder if his claim of receiving help through divine intervention actually had something to it. The Lannisters had of course laid most of the groundwork for their takeover themselves from what you knew, but as you considered how little damage the Vale had actually suffered as the populace was essentially just displaced while the host of the Vale remained intact if disorganized, it felt like things had gone a bit too smoothly. Walls and wells could easily be rebuilt, and given enough resources were invested to restore the roads, towns, and villages, the refugees could be returned to profitable employment in no time at all. And since most houses would naturally be somewhat strained with restoring their lands and keeps after things had settled down, anyone that could provide the needed gold for such efforts would be welcomed with open arms. Add to all of that the fact that the Lannisters had the ability to simply make the castles of troublesome lords vanish into nothing, as they had done with the camp of the mountain clans, and it felt like they had for all intents and purposes already secured themselves the Vale. You knew of course that there was nothing on Westeros that could have stopped the Lannisters from taking the throne, but knowing that the gods actually interfered on their side was still something else entirely. Though you guessed that since the Targaryens were even at the best of days considered sinners with all their incest, you could understand why the gods would side with your master and plough the way for the Lannisters to secure the Vale to take on the Targaryens. You were still under no illusion that they were perfect, but as you once more looked over what the people of Nora had to do for a potential interference by House Arryn, never mind the crown, you had to agree that the realm was indeed in need of some change. Though you wondered why the Lannisters hadn't just received some kind of divine mandate, the Seven Kingdoms were never united when it came to matters of faith, but as far as you could tell there would have been no reason for the Lannisters to take the continent by force if the crown lost the support of the faith. Well, you supposed that the reasoning of the gods would always remain beyond you, despite how much your master has done to bend your mind in ways it shouldn't have been able to, as you did your best to explain the madness he has brought into your life. Though admittedly that wasn't entirely true, there were plenty of possibilities for why the gods might have decided to remain as quiet as usual that you could most certainly comprehend. But even so, you had only hollow confidence supported by little more than your own experiences and lessons to support what you had managed to remember. The answer of course being what you saw around you as you followed a gang of raiders from one of the less charming factions that had made the Forge District their new home. It was easy to forget, as the awareness of the fact tended to fade away quickly every time you interacted with decent people for a change. But deep down in all humans is a core of not just light but also darkness. From the vilest scum of the world to the most righteous of saints, it was always there in the background. And remembering this, it was quite obvious why the gods remained unheard despite their involvement, as even the most stalwart of human souls would naturally fall to its own darkness if provided with such nigh unlimited power over the realm. Power didn't corrupt as far as you knew, but the unlimited desire of humanity for more, be it meaningful or the opposite, be it valuable or simply a fancy of the moment, nothing has plagued humanity more than greed, no matter the severity. And it would make sure that whoever ended up being chosen by the gods would either walk the path into darkness willingly if not consciously, or would end up empty and overburdened. Few stories were as dark or tragic as those that centered around the fall of genuinely good souls, and since the gods had existed for who knows how many millennia, it was quite obvious why they had reservations about granting people the power to actually speak in their name. And despite how much additional work their decision created for your master, you found that you were still glad about it, as you knew for certain that the Seven Kingdoms were far too weakened to deal with the corruption of the faith on top of everything else. Though you still wondered why your master hadn't used the fact that he had managed to secure their support to swing the opinion of the faithful in his favor, since your master usually used everything that wasn't nailed down. Chapter 94. You guessed there were a few reasons that could take the place of your master's motivations that made a decent amount of sense, but you soon supposed that the Forge district was a bit too dangerous for your thoughts to wander around like that. The different gangs you had seen so far were as harmless to you as the average group of bandits you and your companion had encountered on your journey, so despite their obvious displeasure, you weren't really worried about the risks of taking a look. But you were sure that half of the unsavory fellows that enjoyed themselves in Nora would soon take offense with your presence as well if they learned that you had taken care of their gangs, so a bit of caution was in order. For while you knew that the raider gangs currently struggled with their neighbors, you were sure that a new assassin with a perceived hero complex coming from the Sept of Corvus wouldn't be ignored, even if they lost a few streets to their rivals. And while you would have enjoyed a good fight against the raider scum of Nora any day of the week in normal circumstances, that didn't mean you were willing to be looked down upon as a potential victim for so much as a second. You were after all here to make some use of your master's silver, and not to accidentally become a target of these fools because they thought they had a chance while you were distracted by your own thoughts. So you swiftly took a moment to take in your surroundings once more before you approached one of the more impressive forgers that from what you saw still accepted commissions as they forged some swords for the raiders going by their quality. And you found that you were actually impressed as they did everything to make sure their work remained untraceable down to the quality of the steel itself to ensure their heads remained where they were, both now with the raiders in charge and in the future once the errands restored order. It was a fascinating situation to behold, as these swords were still lethal enough to intimidate the unarmored townsfolk of Nora, while they would be as good as useless against the guards of their leaders with their decently made gambesine and chainmail. These smiths were crafty in quite a few ways if they had managed to sell the raider gangs this garbage while they thought of it as a boon, so much so that you wondered if your decision to buy some weapons for the Sept was still a good idea. You were absolutely clueless when it came to the prices the current situation of Nora demanded of its craftsmen for the base materials, let alone how much the smiths of the Forge district could reasonably demand of you for the work they had poured into their various end products. It was a bit of a mess, but the pouches you got from your master still begged you to lighten their load, which after your conscience spoke to you from the side turned out to be enough to get you to move. And besides, you could always visit the smithy and question once things had been set right to make sure the price you got from them wasn't too unreasonable. In the end, you simply bought 10 spears of decent make and another 10 daggers for the priests since they had been banned from wielding anything larger for ages, which you guessed was impressively mirrored in their outlook on life. It annoyed you to no end that you were still so restricted in the actions you could take since the chaos needed to be maintained as it was, but you supposed it was a great opportunity to try a few new tactics and ways of thinking. Normally, you would have simply targeted the leaders of the raider gangs one by one till no one that could draw together more than a dozen men remained, which you would have followed up by burning down their makeshift armories. Yet as things stood, none of the new factions had the strength to prevail against such tactics, so public order would have inevitably returned too soon, which was why you decided to arm one of the older factions instead. 10 spears might not sound like much, but considering how much of the raiders' resources and men were focused on one another, you knew the spears completely changed the cost-to-gain ratio. For while one of the larger gangs could have certainly spared 24 men to raid the Sept and its surroundings anytime they wanted if they ever lost the fear all sane mortals held within their hearts for the wrath of the gods, You knew that the more they plundered the rest of Nora while you traveled to the Eyrie, the more enticed they would become. Greed and desire weren't that easily crushed by fear after all. So other more proven ways to ward against such greed was required, namely the prospect of facing a negative balance followed by facing a mob armed with the weapons they had bought. You knew of course that the Vale was still burned to the ground a dozen villages at a time by the mountain clans, which made your efforts kind of pointless, especially since you had hardened your heart not too long ago. But since you knew of your master's changed outlook towards the mountain clans, you couldn't help but try to save what little you could. It was extremely bothersome that your heart returned to its previous state from where it remained as insistent as you knew it, but since you were aware that all these people suffered for nothing, you found that even your mind agreed with it. The priests, after you offered up one of your pouches and the weapons, had been more than pleased, so you had a place to safely operate from and time to think about it all. Though that being said, you found that as soon as your heart and mind both poked what you supposed was your soul repeatedly, that the gained time felt more like a curse than a blessing. And while you did your best to keep yourself from interfering any further, your mind after a few days had nevertheless, and much to your chagrin, still found a decently sized loophole. The populace of Nora had no knowledge of your presence or the massive losses of the mountain clans, so they feared House Palno would lead them into ruin, as their invasion was more like some unstoppable natural disaster than a war. Though you and your master on the other hand already knew that Lord Palno was a failure that had to be replaced, or he would know once you informed him. And once you combined that your master wouldn't need additional proof like the errands with the fact that the mountain clans lost the strength to simply push into the lands of House Palno, a few new options opened up. For as things stood, if looked upon with the required knowledge, there wasn't any immediate threat Lord Palno could lead his lands and people into ruin with, which meant that if things were retuned to order he could simply be replaced once the Lannisters took over. So the question was if the good Lord Palno was the kind of lord that would put half the town to the sword for their rebellion, or if things would return to normal after the raider gangs were hung, as the latter would have allowed you to finally interfere in earnest. Chapter 95. Yet despite how much potential you saw in your idea, as long as the good Lord Palno still sat in Watermoon and thus out of your reach, there was little you could do to get a proper look at the man. And since you worked for House Lannister, even just the attempt to infiltrate House Palno's seat of power would have been absolute madness, so as things stood you still needed a whole lot more than your good intentions to get this little plan of yours underway. But since you had managed to get a decent grasp on the unwritten rules that governed Nora, it didn't take you long to come up with a way to bypass the little problem of Watermoon being guarded as intently as it was. The populace wanted to get rid of the Palnos, so there was little hope for a compromise. But since the priests of Nora seemed well dispositioned towards you, selling the mob a diplomatic approach might just be possible. And since the prospect of the faith taking a side in this matter had the potential to change everything, you were sure they could at least get you to the gates of Watermoon. So with your heart once more urging you to take action and your mind made up, you started to ask the priests around the sept for help in your little endeavor with the expected amount of success. Mayhaps they would have been more open to take the risk if you had told them who you worked for, but after you considered that your master's letter had played its own little part in all this madness, you swiftly thought better of it. In the end, you still found one that was willing to take the risk, as one of the ancient former knights that joined the priesthood going by the name of Barden turned up on his own accord and squeezed you for the details. He was apparently less than pleased with the state of Nora, the town he was born in, so pressed for other opportunities, you despite your better judgment answered him all of his questions. As the old knight with his trusted station in the priesthood, and his soft heart for the people of Nora was just far too convenient to risk being rejected once more. It stung a bit how little you could actually do once you could no longer employ your blades and tactics as usual, but since any and all lessons in your profession are invaluable, you still found that the blow to your pride was a small price to pay. So after you had successfully recruited the good old Barden, or perhaps he was the one that had been doing the recruiting, you decided that you would be satisfied as long as your scheme still had a chance to succeed, as you failed to come up with any alternatives. There was of course the problem that you had to disclose that you worked for the Lannisters to convince him that marching up to the gates of Watermoon wasn't just a hopeless undertaking. But since that was apparently all he needed to know, you swiftly judged that this was also acceptable, since it wouldn't have remained a secret for all that much longer anyway. As you thought about it all, you couldn't help but once more think that life really had it out for you, or perhaps your secured future simply encouraged your heart to push for risks that would have been unthinkable before. Though despite how much you internally complained about the fact that you were going to try to talk your way through a massive mob of dubious integrity and dozens of raider gangs, you still found that anything less than a proper attempt wouldn't have satisfied your conscience. For despite the deeds that came with your profession and your previous screw-ups, you nevertheless planned to live a decent life, not that you had much success with that in recent times. You couldn't truly erase the bad or outright evil things you had done before, as everything that has already happened is beyond your grasp to fix, but since good deeds were never able to erase the bad ones, that wasn't the point. In the end, what mattered was that if you walked away from Nora while you had the ability to end their vain struggles, you doubted things would ever improve. The most important step towards redemption was after all always the next one. If you said this time that the risks were too great, then it stood to reason that the same would happen the next time you inevitably tried to help some other bunch of unfortunate souls. The estimated gains and risks involved in everything had always occupied your mind, but that was simply because you never really felt like you were indebted to the world as you were now. You didn't know how much it would take to make up what you owed to the world for that many dead children, but since your time in this life was limited and assassins often found their end unexpectedly, you couldn't really afford to push things off into the future like the errands had the habit of doing. Hence, despite the odds, you found yourself walking down the devastated streets of Nora towards the outline of Watermoon far off in the distance, while you and your temporary companion observed the various groups that had claimed the ruins that surrounded you. No one had made a move on you so far, and it seemed unlikely that they would do so while you had a local, well-known priest by your side, but as far as you were concerned, good habits shouldn't be shunned. Especially since a noble of the Westerlands called up to represent the Lannisters had no business killing off the small folk of another great house, so your options were a bit limited. And as you thought about the one that indirectly forced you to work with strategies and tactics you had never used once more, you couldn't help but wonder if your master was in truth perhaps some kind of sadist. As the lack of nobles to take the position remained as unbelievable as it had been when you first heard it from him, the amount of work needed to occupy all nobles of the Westerlands at once would just be far too great. Perhaps the actual truth was that they already knew of your lord's sadistic nature and his tendency to make tasks more difficult than they needed to be, and just claimed they were busy. Yeah, that sounded more believable.